The question of how and why the United Nations is the crux of the great conspiracy to destroy the sovereignty of the United States and the enslavement of the American people within a UN one-world dictatorship is a complete and unknown mystery to the vast majority of the American people. The reason for this unawareness of the frightening danger to our country and to the entire free world is simple. The masterminds behind this great conspiracy have absolute control of all of our mass communications media, especially television, the radio, the press, and Hollywood.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public.
The press, and Hollywood. We all know that our State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House have brazenly proclaimed that they have the right and the power to manage the news, to tell us not the truth, but what they want us to believe. They have seized that power on orders from their masters of the great conspiracy. And the objective is to brainwash the people into accepting the phony peace bait to transform the United States into an enslaved unit of the United Nations one world government. First of all, bear in mind that the so-called UN police action in Korea, fought by the United States, in which 150,000 of our sons were murdered and maimed, was part of the plot, just as the undeclared by Congress war in Vietnam, in which our sons are dying, is part of the plot, just as the plot against Rhodesia and South Africa, in which our sons will be dying, is part of the UN plot. However, the vitally important thing for all Americans, all you mothers of the boys who died in Korea and are now dying in Vietnam, to know is that our so-called leaders in Washington, whom we elected to safeguard our nation and our Constitution, are the betrayers, and that behind them are a comparatively small group of men whose sole objective is to enslave the whole world of humanity in their satanic plot of one world government. Now, in order to give you a very clear picture of this satanic plot, I will go back to its beginning, clear back in the middle of the 18th century, and name the men who put that plot into action, and then bring you down to the present, today's status of that plot. Now, as a matter of further intelligence, a term used by the FBI, let me clarify the meaning of the expression, "he is a liberal." The enemy, meaning the one-word conspirators, have seized upon that word liberal as a cover-up for their activities. It sounds so innocent and so humanitarian to be liberal. Well, make sure that the person who calls himself a liberal or is described as a liberal is not in truth a red. Now then, this satanic plot was launched back in the 1760s when it first came into existence under the name of the Illuminati. This Illuminati was organized by one Adam Weishaupt, born a Jew, who was converted to Catholicism and became a Catholic priest, and then, at the behest of the then newly organized House of Rothschild, defected and organized the Illuminati. Naturally, the Rothschilds financed that operation. And every war since then, beginning with the French Revolution, has been promoted by the Illuminati operating under various names and guises. I say under various names and guises because after the Illuminati was exposed and became too notorious, Weishaupt and his co-conspirators began to operate under various other names. In the United States, immediately after World War I, they set up what they called the Council on Foreign Relations.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. Congressional Record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control. of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news.
And this CFR is actually the Illuminati in the United States. And its hierarchy, the masterminds in control of the CFR, to a very great extent, are the descendants of the original Illuminati conspirators. But to conceal that fact, most of them changed their original family names to American-sounding names. For example, the true name of the Dillons, Clarence and Douglas Dillon, once Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, is Lepowski. I'll come back to all this later. There is a similar establishment of the Illuminati in England, operating under the name of the British Institute of International Affairs. There are similar secret Illuminati organizations in France, Germany, and other nations operating under different names. And all these organizations, including the CFR, continuously set up numerous subsidiary or front organizations that are infiltrated into every phase of the various nations' affairs. But at all times, the operations of these organizations were and are masterminded and controlled by the internationalist bankers, who in turn were and are controlled by the Rothschilds. The details of how they accomplished the setting up of the CFR in the United States, as also in the other nations, are far too voluminous to be described in this dissertation. But you can find it complete in News Bulletin number 122, entitled UN is Spawn of the Illuminati, and News Bulletin number 123, entitled CFR Completely Unmasked as Illuminati. Both are published by the Cinema Educational Guild, Post Office Box 46205, Hollywood, California. You can get them for 50 cents per copy by writing to that address. Those news bulletins reveal the names of the original founders of the Illuminati and the Americanized names of their descendants in the present CFR. Now I'll go back to the activities of the original Illuminati conspirators. As revealed in News Bulletin number 122, one branch of the Rothschild family had financed Napoleon. Another branch of the Rothschilds, both branches the real masterminds of the Illuminati, financed Britain, Germany, and the other nations in the Napoleonic Wars. Immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, the Illuminati assumed that all the nations were so destitute and so weary of wars that they'd be glad for any solution. So the Rothschild stooges set up what they called the Congress in Vienna, and at that meeting they tried to create the first League of Nations, their first attempted one-world government, on the theory that all the crowned heads of European governments were so deeply in debt to them that they would willingly or unwillingly serve as their stooges. But the Tsar of Russia caught the stench of the plot and completely torpedoed it. The enraged Nathan Rothschild, then the head of that dynasty, vowed that someday he or his descendants would destroy the Tsar and his entire family. And his descendants did accomplish that very threat in 1917. At this point, bear in mind that the Illuminati was not set up to operate on a short-range basis. Normally, a conspirator of any type enters into a conspiracy with the expectation of achieving his objective during his own lifetime. But that was not the case with the Illuminati. True, they hoped to accomplish their objective during their lifetime. But, paraphrasing The Show Must Go On, the Illuminati operates on the very long-range basis. Whether it will take scores of years or even centuries, they have dedicated their descendants to keep the pot boiling until they hope the conspiracy is achieved. Now let's go back to the birth of the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt was a Jesuit-trained professor of canon law, teaching in Ingolstadt University when he defected from Christianity to embrace the Luciferian conspiracy. It was in 1770 that the professional moneylenders, the then recently organized House of Rothschild, retained him to revise and modernize the age-old protocols of Zionism, which from the outset was designed to give the synagogue of Satan, so named by Jesus Christ, ultimate world domination, so they could impose the Luciferian ideology upon what would remain of the human race after the final social cataclysm by use of satanic despotism. Weishaupt completed his task May 1st, 1776. Now you know why May 1 is the great day with all communist nations to this very day. That was the day, May 1, 1776, that Weishaupt completed his plan and officially organized the Illuminati to put the plan into execution. That plan required the destruction of all existing governments and religions. That objective was to be reached by dividing the masses of people whom he, Weishaupt, termed Goyim, or human cattle, into opposing camps in ever-increasing numbers on political, social, economic, and other issues, the very conditions we have in our country today. The opposing sides were then to be armed and incidents provided which would cause them to fight and weaken themselves and gradually destroy national governments and religious institutions. Again, I say, the very conditions in the world today. And at this point, let me stress a prime feature of the Illuminati plan. When and if their blueprint for world control, the protocols of the elders of Zion, is discovered and exposed, they would wipe all the Jews off the face of the earth in order to divert suspicions from themselves. If you think this is far-fetched, bear in mind that they permitted Hitler, a liberal socialist himself, who was financed by Krupp, Kennedy, the Warburgs, and the Rothschilds, to incinerate 600,000 Jews. Now, just why did the conspirators choose the word Illuminati for their satanic organization? Weishaupt himself said that the word is derived from Lucifer, and means holders of the light, using the lie that his objective was to bring about a one-world government to enable those with mental ability to govern the world and prevent all wars in the future. In short, using the word peace on earth as his bait, exactly as that same bait, peace, was used by the 1945 conspirators to force the United Nations on us. Weishaupt, financed, I repeat, by the Rothschilds, recruited some 2,000 paid followers. These included the most intelligent men in the fields of arts and letters, education, the sciences, finance, and industry. He then established lodges of the Grand Orient, Masonic lodges, to be their secret headquarters. And I again repeat that in all of this, he was acting under orders from the House of Rothschild. The main features of the Weishaupt plan of operation required his Illuminati to do the following things to help them to accomplish their purpose. Number one, use monetary and sex bribery to obtain control of men already in high places in the various levels of all governments and other fields of endeavor. Once influential persons had fallen for the lies, deceits, and temptations of the Illuminati, they were to be held in bondage by application of political and other forms of blackmail, threats of financial ruin, public exposure and physical harm, even death, to themselves and loved members of their families. Do you realize how many present top officials in our federal government in Washington are controlled in just that way by the CFR? Do you realize how many homosexuals in our State Department, the Pentagon, all federal agencies, even in the White House, are controlled that way? Number two, Illuminati on the faculties of colleges and universities were to cultivate students possessing exceptional mental ability, belonging to well-bred families with international leanings, and recommend them for special training in internationalism. Such training was to be provided by granting scholarships to those selected by the Illuminists. That gives you an idea what a Rhodes Scholarship means. It means indoctrination into accepting the idea that only a one-world government can put an end to recurring wars and strife. That's how the United Nations was sold to the American people. One of the most notable Rhodes Scholars we have in our country is Senator William J. Fulbright, sometimes referred to as Half-Bright. His entire voting record spells Illuminati. All such scholars were to be first persuaded and then convinced that men of special talent and brains have the right to rule those less gifted, on the ground that the masses don't know what is best for them physically, mentally, and spiritually. In addition to the Rhodes and similar scholarships, today there are 3 special Illuminati schools located in Gordonstown in Scotland, Salem in Germany, and Anavryta in Greece. These 3 are known ones, but there are others that are kept undercover. Prince Philip, the husband of Britain's Queen Elizabeth, was educated at Gordonstown at the instigation of Lord Louis Mountbatten, his uncle, a Rothschild relative, who became Britain's admiral of the fleet after World War II ended. Number 3, all influential people trapped into coming under the control of the Illuminati, plus the students who had been specially educated and trained, were to be used as agents and placed behind the scenes of all governments as experts and specialists, so they would advise the top executives to adopt policies which would, in the long run, serve the secret plans of the Illuminati one-world conspiracy and bring about the destruction of the governments and religions they were elected or appointed to serve. Do you know how many such men operate in our government at this very time? Rust, McNamara, Hubert Humphrey, Fulbright, Kuchel, and go on and on and on.
This book was written 50 years ago, and it was presented before Congress in the House of Representatives on January the 10th, 1963. Now, for those of you that can remember back then, you'll remember what our nation was, what kind of mess we were in at that point. I want you to consider for a moment what you're about to see presented here before the House of Representatives. And the book was actually written by a former FBI agent. He worked with the FBI for 16 years, and then he went and became the chief of police in Salt Lake City. And it was during this time that he wrote his famous book called The Naked Communist. Now keep in mind, he worked for the FBI. This guy had inner knowledge of what was going on way back then about what communism was openly trying to get into the United States of America. Now, if you remember where we were at in that time frame, what was going on in the 60s, many of you remember the peace demonstrations, the war, all the riots and everything else. Lots and lots of things were going on. And a lot of things I'm going to share with you in this book literally took place in that little time frame. Matter of fact, he presents 45 goals for overthrowing the United States. Overthrowing it in the sense of making it become communist. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let us look at less than half of them. And I want you to observe these in the next few minutes, and you tell me, you be the judge, ladies and gentlemen, you tell me if this book that's 51 years old, written by a former FBI agent, if this book is not telling exactly the direction our country's going. Now, with this in mind, I want to give you just a few of them. Number 4, and as I said, we'll give you less than half of them, so just stick with me real quickly here. Number 4, permit free trade between all nations, regardless of communist affiliation, and regardless of whether or not items could be used for war. Of course, it was a short time after that we started seeing things in our nation that was made, in effect, by communist nation. For example, I always thought it was kind of funny how American flags are made in China. And it's quite interesting when throughout the years they have interviewed and talked to people about their personal opinion of the products made in China, and how that, it might be cheap, but it was talking about good value and all the other things. It's low on the quality level. Matter of fact, they just was recalling thousands of women kids started buying these flip-flops and started breaking out with these horrendous burns, some second and third degree burns on their feet. And of course, many of you remember a couple years ago when they had all these dogs that were dying because they had food that was being made there in China. Number 11, promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one world government with its own independent armed forces. Well, how many know since then that has literally taken place? Now the UN has its own army, and many of these stand on their own soil. Many of our American citizens are a part of this international army. Number 12, resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. I don't know how many of you saw it during the president's speech. There were a massive amount of pro-Obama, pro-communists that were standing right there in the United States Capitol, proudly waving their communist flags, a part of the United Communist Party of America. When would you have ever thought we'd got to that place? Number 15, capture one or both of the political parties in the U.S. Now keep in mind, this was written 51 years ago. Consider how radical that sounded, and consider today when you look at Newsweek just recently, the front page of the cover of Newsweek magazine openly says, we are all socialists now. Since the election, we're all socialists now. Does one of the political parties seem to be pushing socialist concepts, folks? I know it's kind of hard for us to believe this. That's why we need to pull our heads out of the sand. It is happening right before our very eyes. We are seeing, we're losing an entire political party to this concept. Number 16, use technical decisions to the court of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. Who would have ever thought that you would get to the place in the United States of America that you could not say the Pledge of Allegiance because it said one nation under God? Who would have ever thought, folks, that a judge would keep kids from saying the Pledge of Allegiance, ban them from doing so? Number 17, talking about schools, listen to this. Get control. This is 51 years ago. Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of the Teachers Association. Put the party line in textbooks. Well, every one of those things have been fulfilled to a T. Just last month, one of the National Education Association's top lawyer said openly in a speech, said that those who promote traditional values are a group of white-winged blank. Starts with a B. Now, these are the people that are teaching our children. And we'll talk more about the school thing in a minute. Number 21, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. I think that pretty much goes, undisputed. It seems today that CNN has turned into the communist news network. When you look at the junk that's on television today, and it's you believe it and you obey it because it's on TV. Number 22, continue discrediting American culture by degrading, now listen to this is pretty incredible, by degrading all forms of artistic expression. Now it's going to sound bizarre, but listen to what he says. An American communist cell was told to, quote, eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Now, why would an FBI agent uncover this from the communist attempt to take over when all of a sudden you start looking, and literally, as you look, it's almost as if art has become shapeless, meaningless forms. Matter of fact, this is the most acceptable form of art in our nation today. Number 23 has to do with this when it says control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan is to promote, now listen to this, to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. And why? Now I want to think about this. Anybody that understands the power of the arts, and this is why we need to pray that God will raise up our children to be aggressive light and salt in the art industry. Because, folks, it's taken over by liberals, taken over by homosexuals, taken over by communist, socialistic minds. When you look at just some of the arts that are traveling the country, right now there's one that's crisscrossing the country for well over 2 years now, where you just get to look at people who died, and they didn't know who they were or whatever. They just took these people's bodies and used them as art displays. They cut their bodies in half so you can walk around and look at their insides of their bodies and everything else. There at the top there you see a guy reading the power of books, and it explodes. His brains are scattered across the wall. Here's a piece of art that hung in an art institute for a long time called Dyke. And then, of course, you see this little kid all make-upped out and all the rest. And then, of course, all the sadomasochism, the ugliness, the perversion, the filth, and it's all considered art. Number 24, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Nothing could get any worse than this when you think of child pornography. And so what they've done, they have done what they call virtual child porn, where they'll take the body of an adult that looks young, and then they'll put a child's face on it to make it technically legal. And of course, unlimited what they'll do with that person's body. Number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion picture, radio, and TV. Of course, 51 years ago, never anybody even heard of the internet, never even concept of the internet. And yet today, folks, when you think of the porn industry and how it's just dominated all the airways, all the technical things, everything coming through satellite and cable and all the rest. Number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. I don't know how many of you have seen the tendency in recent years not to just say we have the right to be homosexual, but now we want homosexuals to be the spiritual leaders. We want to ordain ministers as homosexuals. We want to let them lead us because God made us this way, and we want God to be approving of our acts. So God bless us, and God made me gay, and God made us queer, and God loves me, and all the rest. But of course, this is all part of an amazing thing. Incidentally, I don't know how many saw this on the news a while back, but a California teacher passed out these cards produced by the Gay, Lesbians, and Straight Education Network to her class of kindergartners. And what it says there, you see this little card here, and this particular one is signed by a little boy named Ronald. By signing this card, I, Ronald, am taking a stand for a safe and harassment-free school for all students regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity expression. It goes on to describe that you're not going to say anything against lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. This is kindergartners. And listen, folks, the communists said, if we can get America to break this down, we'll have them. Of course, number 27 says, infiltrate the churches. Replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible. And emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. I think it was interesting when Newsweek had a cover story earlier this year. I think it was around the spring. It says the decline and fall of Christian America. Now think about this. Earlier, just about a month before that, was we're all socialists now. So as socialism is gaining and the church is starting to lose, you remember what was said? That one guy said, socialism becomes a religion when people lose their religion. You know, when you think of the fact that the NIV, the translating committee, hired a lesbian to help translate was on the translating committee of the most widely used translation of churches in America and Christians in America. That's why you will never read the word sodomites in the Bible anymore in the NIV. Matter of fact, when they do refer to a homosexual, they make sure you qualify it by saying a homosexual offender, Read 1 Corinthians where it talks about those that will not enter the kingdom of God. It doesn't say homosexual anymore in the NIV. It says a homosexual offender. It's not technically being a homosexual that will make you there. It's if you are a homosexual offender, like a heterosexual offender. It's the dumbing down and the discrediting of God's word. Incidentally, if your children or grandkids are on the internet very much, they've probably been to a site called YouTube, which is filled with all kinds of videos. And one of the most popular videos that has been viewed on YouTube is a video series that not only displays the fact America is a loser country, but that atheism and agnosticism is the only way that you should live your life. Incidentally, this whole movement is a countercultural group of young kids, even going down to junior hires now, junior high, senior high, and especially college kids who consider God a delusion. The whole concept of God, you have to be an idiot to believe in God. Number 28, eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that violates the principle of separation of church and state, which is one of the most obvious destructive lies that's ever been. It's nowhere in our Constitution, nowhere in the Bill of Rights. Nothing is said about this, but it's a concept that's now literally pushed prayer out of our schools. Number 29, I'm trying to get through these as quickly as I can. How many are sticking with me tonight? How many can see that this is happening before our very eyes? You say, John, where are you going with this? Well, I'm going to tell you something, folks. Jesus said, when the salt has lost its ability to hold back corruption, when the salt has lost its savor, when the salt cannot preserve, guess what? It is henceforth good for nothing. Let me go back to this. I didn't read this. Discredit the American Constitution. This is an FBI writing this 51 years ago who had the inner knowledge of what communism was trying to do. How many know they got time and they're willing to take time because what one generation may not let get by with, maybe the next one accept it. So you do it by discrediting the American Constitution, by calling it inadequate and old-fashioned and now out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on worldwide basis. Now we're considering that the Constitution isn't important anymore. Why worry about the Constitution? Why consider it important? Because it's an old, outdated manuscript. We don't live like those people wanted us to live. And now, guess what, folks? Colleges, which are starting up all across the country this week, kids will be in there during all the controversy of socialism right now, and these kids are being taught by a majority of liberal scholars and teachers and philosophers that America doesn't need a constitution anymore. Incidentally, when you think of the fact that our Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights is becoming attacked. Did you know that when Mr. Obama was Senator of Illinois, he voted against the Second Amendment 4 times? Now think of this, folks. He's now the President of the United States of America. Do you honestly think that he's changed his policy? Absolutely not. Number 30, discredit the American founding fathers. Now this one really ticked me off when I started studying on this. Present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. I actually just typed in founding fathers just to find out what, and I was absolutely blown away that they're referred to. One site called them domestic terrorists. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, just to name a few, were mocked and ridiculed as idiots, as stupid, as selfish, and as every kind of lame word they could come up with.
Damn right, because think about the Christians, okay? Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? No. What did they do? They took your head off. They beheaded you if you didn't accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. See, this is reality. Yeah, they're terrorists, but the bottom line is to them, they are not. Now, why is that important to understand? Because they are as committed to their cause and to their way of life as you are yours. And they see you as being wrong. That's very different. When people are passionate about what they believe in, they become a very difficult enemy to be. Who was the first terrorist organization in the United States? Who?
Founding Fathers.
Founding Fathers. You mean Thomas Jefferson?
Oh, yeah.
You mean George Washington?
Oh, yeah.
Paul Revere?
Yeah.
These guys right here, let me ask you something. Did they try to scare people?
Oh, yeah.
They tried to intimidate the British. Did they use acts of violence? Your founding fathers, my founding fathers, were involved in acts of terrorism against British officials because they systematically had British officials assassinated. The guys who we call our founding fathers, George Washington, Mr. Honest, who cut down a cherry tree and admitted it, is the same guy who signed death orders, if you will, on members of the British government, the British Crown, who they wanted to eliminate because politically they had influence in certain pockets of the United States, at that time the 13 colonies, and they wanted to divide and conquer.
Number 31, belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the grounds that it's only a minor part of the big picture. Today, when you go to schools, folks, it's amazing how dumb our kids are really becoming. The dumbing down of our kids. They don't know the basics. I remember the first time I heard, and it was just a few years ago, that Christopher Columbus was a bad guy. I'd been raised all my life taught that he was a great guy. Well, no more. Matter of fact, every year when Columbus Day comes around, it's almost like the news has to go out of its way to present him as one of the worst citizens that has ever lived. Of course, number 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture. Education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health. I think that pretty much goes undisputed, how that's becoming more and more an obvious trend in our country today. The government's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Number 38, transfer. Now this one's really scary. Transfer some of the power of arrest from the police to social agencies. Now listen to this, 51 years ago. Treat all behavioral problems as psychiatric disorders which no one but psychiatrists can understand or treat. Well, how many know today that there are so many of our kids on prescription drugs where all they needed is some dad or some mom to love them enough to get the belt out and show them what's right and wrong. But now we don't correct our kids, we don't whip our kids, we say, well, they need a timeout, we give them some drugs. Folks, are we idiots? What's wrong with us? This is communistic, by the way. Number 39, dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over these to oppress those who oppress communist goals. And believe it or not, folks, it's getting more and more obvious as the tax issues come along. One day, somebody's going to wake up and say, hey, what about all these churches that don't have to pay taxes? And they're not walking with us. They're not standing with us. Well, you know what would happen, sad to say. Shouldn't be that way, but once they lost their tax exempt status, many of these churches would and organizations, nonprofit organization would just fold up. And of course, number 40, and I think we're getting real close to the end here. Discredit the family as an institution. Now listen to this. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. I thought it was interesting. I was preaching last week and I stayed in a hotel, and I don't even turn my TV on anymore when I get a hotel. It's just like, you know what? I just go and unplug it. It's not even worth wasting my time. But it's laying right on the top of the television is HBO's order for the month, and the advertisement is a new series HBO's doing called Hung, and it's talking about how a particular part of a man's body is built, and how that he's become a hot item among all these women because he's hung. And so the whole series, which will run into many weeks, is how sexual promiscuity is something that now women can sit and watch and be entertained, because now it no longer it's the use for the men, but now it's the whole thing. And then of course the whole easy divorce. It's incredible today how there is many divorces in the church world, and more so than there is even in the non-church world, because it's just simple. Now obviously when this book was written 51 years ago, it was about 1 out of 1,000 people were getting divorced. Now it's 1 out of every 2. Wonder if there's a little story behind this somehow. Number 41, and I think this is my last one, emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have, because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families, and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Now the moms and the dads are becoming the bad person. Matter of fact, Hillary Clinton wrote years ago this book called It Takes a Village, which basically boils down to you as a parent really don't have the ability to raise your kids. That's why you need the government. You don't have the right to tell your kids what they can and cannot do. They're owned by, see, you know, folks, we gave them this right, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, I applaud any mother that's got the courage and the guts and the sacrifice to try to train their own children. Because I got news for you, you have your only other choice is send them to the government schools, and believe it or not, folks, you give them to the government and they'll produce them exactly the way they want them produced.
Similar scholarships. Today there are 3 special Illuminati schools located in Gordonstown in Scotland, Salem in Germany, and Anavryta in Greece. These 3 are known ones, but there are others that are kept undercover. Prince Philip, the husband of Britain's Queen Elizabeth, was educated at Gordonstown at the instigation of Lord Louis Mountbatten, his uncle, a Rothschild relative who became Britain's admiral of the fleet after World War II ended. Number 3, all influential people trapped into coming under the control of the Illuminati, plus the students who had been specially educated and trained, were to be used as agents and placed behind the scenes of all governments as experts and specialists, so they would advise the top executives to adopt policies which would, in the long run, serve the secret plans of the Illuminati one-world conspiracy and bring about the destruction of the governments and religions they were elected or appointed to serve. Do you know how many such men operate in our government at this very time? Rust, McNamara, Hubert Humphrey, Fulbright, Keitel, and go on and on and on. Number 4, perhaps the most vital directive in White House plan was to obtain absolute control of the press, at that time the only mass communications media, to distribute information to the public, so that all news and information could be slanted, so that the masses could be convinced that a one-world government is the only solution to our many and varied problems. Now do you know who owns and controls our mass communications media? I'll tell you, practically all the movie lots in Hollywood is owned by the Leymans, Kuhn Loeb and Company, Goldman Sachs, and other internationalist bankers. All the national radio and TV channels in the nation are owned and controlled by those same internationalist bankers. The same is true of every chain of metropolitan newspapers and magazines, also of the press wire services, such as Associated Press, United Press International, etc. The supposed heads of all those media are merely the fronts for the internationalist bankers, who in turn compose the hierarchy of the CFR, today's Illuminati in America. Now can you understand why the Pentagon's press agent Sylvester so brazenly proclaimed that the government has the right to lie to the people? What he really meant was that our CFR-controlled government had the power to lie to and be believed by the brainwashed American people. And let's again go back to the first days of the Illuminati. Because Britain and France were the two greatest world powers in the late years of the 18th century, Weishaupt ordered the Illuminati to foment the colonial wars, including our Revolutionary War, to weaken the British Empire and organize the French Revolution to destroy the French Empire. He scheduled the French Revolution to start in 1789. However, in 1784, a true act of God placed the Bavarian government in possession of evidence which proved the existence of the Illuminati, and that evidence could have saved France if they, the French government, hadn't refused to believe it. Here is how that act of God happened. It was in 1874 that Weishaupt issued his orders for the French Revolution. A German writer named Zwack put it into book form. It contained the entire Illuminati story and Weishaupt's plans. A copy of this book was sent to the Illuminists in France, headed by Robespierre, whom Weishaupt had delegated to foment the French Revolution. The courier was struck and killed by lightning as he rode through Raleston on his way from Frankfurt to Paris. The police found the subversive documents on his body and turned them over to the proper authorities. After careful study of the plot, the Bavarian government ordered the police to raid Weishaupt's newly organized lodges of the Grand Orient and the homes of his most influential associates. All additional evidence thus discovered convinced the authorities the documents were genuine copies of the conspiracy by which the Illuminati planned to use wars and revolutions to bring about the establishment of a one-world government, the powers of which they, headed by the Rothschilds, intended to usurp as soon as it was established.
A new world order.
Exactly in line with the United Nations plot of today. In 1785, the Bavarian government outlawed the Illuminati and closed the lodges of the Grand Orient.
We have a real chance.
In 1786, they published all the details of the conspiracy. The English title of that publication is The Original Writings of the Order and Sect of the Illuminati. Copies of the entire conspiracy were sent to all the heads of church and state in Europe. But the power of the Illuminati, which was actually the power of the Rothschilds, was so great that this warning was ignored. Nevertheless, Illuminati became a dirty word, and it went underground. At the same time, Weishaupt ordered Illuminists to infiltrate into the lodges of Blue Masonry and form their own secret societies within all secret societies. Only Masons who proved themselves internationalists and those whose conduct proved they had defected from God were initiated into the Illuminati. Thenceforth,
Within the
the
next 4 years, we will
conspirators
see
donned the
the
cloak
emergence
of
of a new
philanthropy
international
and humanitarianism to conceal their revolutionary and subversive activities. In order to infiltrate into Masonic lodges in Britain, Weishaupt invited John Robeson over to Europe. Robeson was a high-degree Mason in the Scottish Rite. He was a professor of natural philosophy at Edinburgh University and secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Robeson did not fall for the lie that the objective of the Illuminati was to create a benevolent dictatorship, but he kept his reactions to himself so well that he was entrusted with a copy of Weishaupt's revised conspiracy for study and safekeeping. Anyway,
what would he say?
Because the heads of state and church in France were deluded into ignoring the warnings given them, the revolution broke out in 1789 as scheduled by Weishaupt. In order to alert other governments to their danger, in 1798, Robeson published a book entitled Proof of a Conspiracy to Destroy All Governments and Religions. But his warnings were ignored, exactly as our American people have been ignoring all warnings about the United Nations and the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. Now here is something that will stun and very likely outrage many who hear this. But there is documentary proof that our own Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton became students of Weishaupt. Jefferson was one of Weishaupt's strongest defenders when he was outlawed by his government. And it was Jefferson who infiltrated the Illuminati into the then newly organized lodges of the Scottish Rite in New England. Here is the proof. In 1789, John Robeson warned all Masonic leaders in America that the Illuminati had infiltrated into their lodges. And on July 19, 1789, David Papin, president of Harvard University, issued the same warning to the graduating class and lectured them on the influence Illuminism was acquiring on American politics and religion. And to top it off, John Quincy Adams, who had organized the New England Masonic Lodges, issued his warning. He wrote 3 letters to Colonel William L. Stone, a top Mason, in which he exposed how Jefferson was using Masonic lodges for subversive responsibility of the whole of mankind.
In Europe, the view that America is part of what has gone wrong in our world, rather than a force to help us make it right, has become all too common. Yes, there have been differences between America and Europe. No doubt there will be differences in the future. But the burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. A change of leadership in Washington will not lift this burden. In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the only way, the one way, to protect our common security and advance our common humanity. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that our future will be defined by Your Majesties, Mr. Prime Minister, leaders and dignitaries of the European Union, representatives of our NATO alliance, distinguished guests, men and women just like us. We claim to be the sole arbiter of what is right or wrong in the world, and we exercise our power. Part of what makes us different is that we welcome the responsibilities that come with global leadership, to play a growing role on the world stage, and we consider that a good thing. It reflects the future is ours. We are grateful for your friendship. We stand together as inseparable. We meet here at a moment of testing and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build. Throughout human history, societies have grappled with fundamental questions of how to organize themselves, the proper relationship between the individual and the state, the best means to resolve inevitable conflicts between states, through centuries of struggle, through war and repression, a military solution, and revolution, an example of the West interfering in the affairs of a smaller country, just as they're doing now. Grab its resources for our own gain, that a particular set of ideals began to emerge. If we applied a cold-hearted calculus, the belief that power is derived from the consent of the governed, and that laws and institutions should be established to protect that understanding. Those ideals have often been threatened. Ordinary men and women are too small-minded to govern their own affairs. Order and progress can only come when individuals surrender their rights to an all-powerful sovereign. This vision roots itself in the notion that by virtue of race or faith or ethnicity, some are inherently superior to others, and that individual identity must be defined by us versus them, or that national greatness must flow not by what people stand for, but what they are against. The advance of industry and technology outpaced our ability to resolve our differences peacefully because we stood together for the ideals we share. Globalization, global ideology, dictatorship, security through brute force, a military solution. The darker forces, recently amplified by the worst economic crisis of our lifetimes, might makes right, will only increase. And that's what's at stake. I believe this because these ideals that we affirm are true. These ideals are universal. Yes, we believe in opposition parties and censored information. No amount of propaganda is wrong. That's what makes us strong. And our enduring strength is also reflected in our international system that protects in defense of these ideals. And in that promise, we will never waver, and we're prepared to do more. Going forward, every NATO member state must step up and carry its share of the burden. By showing the political will to invest in our collective, we must meet the challenge to our ideals, to our very international order, with strength and conviction. That's what makes us who we are. Will make a critical difference in whether or not the international order that so many generations before you have strived to create continues to move forward, or whether it retreats. And that's the question we all must answer. And I believe that if we hold firm to our principles and are willing to back our beliefs with courage and resolve and tyranny, because that is what forever stirs in the human heart. Thank you very much.